Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. And don't forget to support me on Subscribestar Locals and Buy Me a Coffee. So while we wait for some guests to trickle in, tonight's episode is going to be an explanation of the material causes behind the trans movement. So as a brief introduction to all this, obviously since recent events with Charlie Kirk and elsewhere, Minneapolis, the idea of the transgender movement, especially on the right, is seen as this incomprehensible entity. And the intellectual side is different, and that's been investigated somewhat, but this side has been completely left untouched. And what I want to do now is show that, okay, how is such a thing possible, right? It's one thing to say that a certain set of ideas leads to a certain outcome. That's not sufficient to explain the outcome. Because, for example, without certain technologies, for example, the airplane, the thought of man flying existed, and you can trace it from Icarus to Francis Bacon, but couldn't do anything about it because we didn't have airplanes, right? So we still have to have a material reality that backs up and undergirds this. So with that in mind, and without any further ado, tonight's discussion will be trans, the identity, as a commodity. Trans as a commodity. From the right, the trans movement has taken on the appearance of a monster from Nietzsche's abyss, something that exists but is utterly unaccountable. It is either ridiculed as delusional or feared for being unexplained. From the POV of married couples with children, a further layer of fear is added. The fear that their children might be lost to this identity. School, TV, social media, even friends can be seen as possible vectors for this contagion. Some appeal to postmodernism as the intellectual cause of the trans movement, which isn't necessarily wrong, but the real stumper, though, and the focus on tonight's show is the material cause. What aspects of physical reality allow for the expression of gender confusion? Here, they're nonplussed. The main reason for this is that Americans on the right have the blind spot called love of capitalism. See, for these people, all the good things from capitalism are intrinsic to capitalism. All the bad things are just crazy leftists sabotaging the system, a sort of free market version of Stalin's Wreckers. It would all work if we just didn't have these people that are the natural byproducts of capital, but whatever. The left sees the trans movement as just another civil rights identity on the long road to political equality. If the political left in the U.S. stood for anything, it was anti-capitalism and labor rights. Not so today. The leftists noticed how day in and day out the hegemony of capitalism waxes, yet they have no idea why. That their own fetish for civil rights activism and propping up bourgeois decadence is the main reason why this is so never crosses the horizon of their intellect. Trans kids are just boys and girls whose true self is being oppressed by society, in need of the freedom of expression to change their bodies if needs be. That the trans identity is capitalism seeking to recast the principle of alienation into something more manageable is beyond their ken. The rising tide of corporate support for the Rainbow Coalition should have been a red light to these people, but it was not. In 2011-2012, when I was watching the last phase of the anti-globalist left peter out, they used to say, we don't want tokens in the capitalist system. We want to destroy the capitalist system. By tokens, what is meant are persons whom the left deems as oppressed, being given positions of authority as a human shield for the government or corporations. I knew then, and history has since proven me right, that of course they wanted tokens, and they got lots of them. If the left and right cannot account for the trans movement, what can? Broadly, the old left's systematic critique of capitalism. The trans movement is the commodification of sex for the purposes of one generating large amounts of revenue and falsifying and falsely identifying alienation with gender confusion. First, what is a commodity? A commodity is something that is produced for the purpose of exchanging for something else, and as such is the material form given to a fundamental social relation. Simply, a commodity is a thing produced to be exchanged for something else of equal value in the market. Prior to the financial revolution, outside of the world's oldest profession, the commodification of sex was resisted by nearly all historical societies. Here, though, I'm not talking about sex as a verb, but as a noun. That is the biological sex a man or a woman is designated with. The commodification here is in sex as an identity. A gender fluid man claims he is a man one day and a woman the next. That this could generate a lot of money is not surprising to anyone. What might be surprising is the reframing of alienation. A man is alienated from the world he lives in part, via his alienation from labor, because a man must work for a wage in a capitalist system. His body, his labor, and the product of both are owned or at least controlled by the capitalist. This alienates the worker from his body, his labor, and the product of his labor. This radical disassociation is treated by late-stage capitalist societies not as alienation from production, but from one's true self, a sort of Gnostic woo-woo. This true self can only be realized and revealed by accepting any number of tailor-made identities for you to embrace and demonstrate through consumption, sexual identity being one. This process creates a false consciousness of gender confusion. This person will have the same level of investment in the system as someone in the trades or small business community, not for economic investment, but psychological investment. Let's imagine a man named Dopey. Dopey is alienated from his work and stuck in the cash nexus. He feels alone and confused, bombarded by all sorts of imaginary images of impossible realities in film, TV, and the news, as well as social media. His understanding of reality is tenuous at best. He gets it into his head he is a woman some days, but then reverts back to being a man on other days. This is the gender fluid stage. Dopey thinks life works out better for him as a woman. After all, society is rigged in favor of women after all, so Dopey thinks he's a woman. He's no longer gender fluid, but a trans woman. That is a man who identifies himself as a woman. He then goes through all the surgeries, and on the other side is on a lifetime cocktail of drugs till he dies. If we look at Dopey, we see a captive market with inelastic demand for drugs. A captive market exists when the consumer has little or no choice in his supplier. Demand for a good is inelastic when no matter how the price fluctuates, you, the consumer, still must have it. A good example is gasoline. We all drive cars. We all buy gasoline no matter how high the price gets. For Dopey, the inelastic demand is for hormonal replacement therapy or HRT. If you want the trans identity to stick, you can't stop. This is Dopey's sexual gasoline. Well, all of a sudden, being a consumer in a captive market and reliant on inelastic demand for HRT, all that class consciousness stuff and direct action goes out the window. I mean, you wouldn't want to upend the production that keeps your identity alive, would you? How long will Dopey be Dolly if he stops taking HRT? This has the effect of harnessing alienation and rerouting it back into capital to create a loyalist, where one was previously at risk of developing a class consciousness. Let us look at this market, shall we? On the consumer end, we have three targets: the hardcore trans, the not-so-hardcore trans, and the fellow travelers. The hardcore trans are those who go through the surgeries and HRT. The not-so-hardcore trans fall short of surgeries and may or may not use HRT. And the fellow travelers are not themselves trans, but view trans as a civil rights issue and want to show support. The largest potential market of all is that market by which trans identity is shown, as it caters to not just trans persons, but everyone else. This is not a real identity that is born out of human biology, but a synthetic identity born out of late-stage capitalism. All three groups have a galaxy of products to consume to show that they either are or stand in solidarity with trans people. A more narrow market is the market for the hardcore trans, the cost of surgeries, HRT, and more. The entire process of sexual alienation as it is set up from head to tail, a lot of money is made. Using Grok, I broke down the trans market into 5 categories, which with projected revenue for each in 2025 worldwide. The 5 stages are diagnosis and consultation, hormone replacement therapy, HRT, gender surgeries, post-surgery and maintenance, and consumer and products and signaling. Diagnosis and consultation. Description. Initial psychological evaluations. Therapy and gender dysphoria diagnosis, often required for insurance, HRT, surgery, gatekeeping. This stage targets all tiers, but is the entry for hardcore and not so hardcore, recasting alienation as a treatable identity mismatch. Players. Mental health services, endocrinologist visits, anywhere from $200 to $500 a session. Diagnostic tools. Providers, clinics like Planned Parenthood, insurers, e.g. ACA mandatory coverage, bundled in broader transgender healthcare. 2025 revenue estimates, $0.5 to $1 billion. Estimated as 15 to 20% of overall market, often not isolated. U.S. transgender mental health spending contributes to $0.3 billion annually per integrated care models. Global transgender healthcare, including this stage, projected at $3.13 billion total. HRT. Description. Lifelong or long-term drug regimes, e.g. estrogen for MTF, testosterone for FTM, puberty blockers. Core for hardcore and many not so hardcore. Creates inelastic demand tying users to wages, pharma. Players, drugs, estrogen, testosterone, and anti-androgens, $30 to $100 a month out of pocket. Pharma giants, Pfizer, Abivai, Eli Lilly. Distribution, retail pharmacies, hospitals. Segmented by transition, MTF, FTM. 2025 revenue estimates, US $1.8 billion from $1.73 billion in 2024, 4.6% growth CAGR. Global, $2 to $3 billion, subset of the broader HRT market at $39.64 billion with Trans-Pacific. Thailand's budget allocates $4.3 million for HRT to 200,000 trans individuals. Surgeries. I won't go into the details on that, but hardcore is defining stage, high upfront costs, $20K to $150K per procedure, often insured but with barriers. That's where the money's coming in, folks, right here. $150K per procedure? That's nuts. Players, hospitals, clinics, major facilities, surgeons, medical tourism, e.g. Thailand. Types, MTF, facial feminization, FTM, chest masculinization. North America leads. 2025 revenue estimate, global $2.93 billion from $2.68 billion in 2024, 7.27% growth CAGR. Alternatives range from 0.88 to 3.13 billion depending on scope. US 0.86 billion, part of North America's 1.23 billion, growth driven by AI, 3D tech, and procedures. Post-surgery and maintenance. Revisions, 20 to 30% rate. Monitoring, labs, $200 to $500 a year. Adjunct therapies. Sustains hardcore dependency, includes lifelong HRT escalation. Players, follow-up care. Revisions, $10,000 to $50,000. Devices, prosthetics. Providers, specialty clinics, pharma for adjuncts. 2025 revenue estimates. 0.6 to 1 billion global. U.S. combined post-op HRT monitoring, $0.4 billion. Lifetime person at this stage, $10,000 to $50,000 beyond initial costs. So you could have a guy that was $150,000 to turn into a woman, and then another $50,000 for the rest of his life. That's $200K. That's not bad. Consumer product and signaling. Description, MERS for showcasing, flags $10 to $20, t-shirts $20 to $30, binders $30 to $100. Media films, apps, events. Spans all tier, hardcore post-op apparel, not so hardcore pronoun pins. Fellow travelers, ally swag, pink washing by brands like Hollister. Retailers, Target, Etsy, media, Netflix docs, beauty spending, merch. 2025 revenue estimates. Global LGBTQ plus consumer spending power, 1.4 to 1.7, I guess. I don't know, it didn't explain it. That could either be trillion, which sounds like a lot, or maybe just billions. I don't know. But trans subset, 5 to 10%, or 70 to 170 billion. U.S. store spending by LGBTQ plus, 80 billion, 10% more trips, 7% more spend. Pride merch, 70% customer support, but corporate pullback, 39% of brands scaling down. Beauty segment, 18% of dollars. Trans-specific, $100 to $500 per year on goods that showcase your solidarity. Grog estimated that during an entire lifetime, a hardcore trans individual might spend in excess of $100,000. Pharma and hospitals take 60 to 70% of this medical pie. Business is good. Seeing as 2025 is not yet complete, let us look at the year 2024 for complete quarterly data. Okay, diagnosis. Okay, we've already covered that. So we'll look at the money here. For the diagnosis phase, again, $200 to $500 a session. The global estimate for 2024 at this stage was 2 to 3 billion, 25% of this dysphoria market. HRT, so again, $300 to $100 a month from pharma, Pfizer, AbbVie. 3.8 billion extrapolated from US 1.73 billion, assuming 45% regional share. Surgeries, hardcore focus anywhere from $20 to $150,000. And then the global market value was $2.73 billion. Maintenance, okay, follow-up services, 10 to 50,000 over a lifetime. For that year is 3 to 4 billion. Estimated 30 to 35% of dysphoria market, including ongoing care. Media merch, all tiers, and that was at 2.2 billion. Looking at the year 2024, this entire market worldwide is worth USD 14.53 billion, with stages 1 to 4 of the market accounting for 11.97 billion, and the remainder by stage 5. So what does this tell us? It tells us that most of the money is actually made in catering to the hardcore and not so hardcore trans. Though in theory, the upper size of the market is determined by stage 5, which can include the fellow travelers who you can cater to so they can show solidarity to the cause. So this whole thing is being milked. Money is the game. Money is the game. There's a lot of money to be made at all ends of this process. 2 possible reactions are likely to occur at this point. One right-coded and one left-coded. The right-coded response goes something like this. I would never do that. I don't know why you think this is a necessary part of the market. This objection is rooted in incredulity. The conservative cannot imagine someone wanting to profit off such a gruesome exploitation of individuals. This either speaks to the conservative's character as someone who would not be so heartless, or has limited imagination. By limited imagination, I mean he does not do X to make money, not because of moral qualms, but because, like Wolf Larson, he failed to find the right opportunity to get into a position to do anything on that scale. These 2 reactions are themselves rooted in a naive and fetishistic view of capitalism in the first place. Rather than a relentless force of commodification that seeks to extend the cash nexus to all spheres of life, it is rather the common sense mechanism for all self-made men to get ahead. If only the leftist loonies and cheating megacorps stop getting in the way. As if these 2 are separate from capitalism itself. The left, being completely delusional at this point, would never follow the money. The left never did follow the money when it came to their pet projects, at least as long as I've been alive. This is in part because the frozen conflict led by counter gangs, known as the Culture War, succeeded in derailing the really radical part of the American left with regards to the anti-war and pro-labor elements. The modern left represents a sort of decayed aristocracy whereby through wealth, anomie, and decadence, a slow corrupting element has developed and displaced all the better characteristics. This leads to a weird fetishization of human sexuality. First, to my mind, commented on by George Orwell in his 1945 essay, Notes on Nationalism, where in the section called Color Feeling, he talks about how the liberals and radicals of his own age viewed the Negro as a sexual totem. This has continued to its logical conclusion with the trans movement, whereby their misdirected sexual impulse is negated in an act of nihilistic atavism. A thing is what a thing does. The trans movement, as hard as it is to accept, in reality has nothing to do with sexual identity at all. The entire movement serves capital in 2 ways, exoterically and esoterically. Exoterically, and this is still hidden to most, is just to make money. There is a $14 billion global market after all. We'll leave the gains on the table, right? Esoterically, this is capital exploiting the alienation it engenders by turning it into sexual dysphoria. What does this do? It personalizes the problem into a suppressed true self that is in need of expression. Luckily, capitalism is able to provide the means to fulfill this expression. In so doing, capital is generating a false consciousness of sexual dysphoria. This false consciousness prevents the formation of any true class consciousness and replaces this with a subservient class of dependent consumers in a captive market with inelastic demand for drugs. In short, this is all about preventing the formation of a class consciousness that could, in time, provide the groundswell for a bottom-up resistance to capital's control. We further need to discuss why a set of sexual identities born out of late-stage capitalism should be representative of anti-capitalism at all. Such behaviors in actually existing socialist regimes were classified as bourgeois decadence. That the modern left should see trans persons as allies in the struggle against capital shows how profoundly they have missed the mark. Capital has turned sexual identity into the new middle class. A trans person is just as tied to capital via market conditions as the middle class shop proprietor. Both could not exist in their current form without the underlying material conditions of capital. The trans person then becomes shock troops for the regime, as they know they have no future outside of or after it. From at risk revolutionary to slave to the system, mission accomplished. In summary, the trans movement is a captive market where trans persons are trapped with an inelastic demand for drugs for the rest of their lives, much like Baron Harkonnen's minions. There is a massive market to make money. This market has three kinds of consumers: the hardcore, the not so hardcore, and the fellow travelers. This market can be divided into 5 categories: diagnosis and consultation, hormone replacement therapy, HRT, gender surgeries, post-surgery and maintenance, and consumer products and signaling. Corporations make a killing at each stage. Stage 1 to 4 cater to trans persons directly, and stage 5 to trans persons and their allies. This is a $14 billion global market. This alone explains the trans movement. Furthermore, this is an effort by capital to harness the alienation it generates into a commodity to exploit by redirecting the latent developing class consciousness into a false consciousness of sexual dysphoria in order to turn this potentially revolutionary into a loyalist. These loyalists become the bodyguard of capital. The right and the left both fail to see this for blind spots, market fetishism and sexual fetishism, respectively. Only a clear-eyed account of this phenomenon can give any hope in dealing with the future. Chuck M. Ned Ludd wouldn't have let this happen. Well, King Ludd wouldn't have let a lot of things happen. A few things to wrap up with here is, again, ideas alone don't explain why a thing is. You still have to have certain technological realities to make it possible. You could have the dream of man flying, but without an airplane, good luck, right? You could have these artificially stimulated sexual dysphoria, but if you don't have any way to act on it through complex, quote-unquote, medicine, you wouldn't be able to do it. Not only that, it's worse. Without the conditioning and the programming, you wouldn't even think it. Because this is not a product of nature. This is not a product of one's environment under normal conditions. This is the product of one living in techno-capital. So almost all the stuff in your head has been planted there. Not all of it's bad, but, here, there's no, you can't check. Most people can't check what their headcanon against what's going on in the real world. And that's on purpose. So, but these people get extra trapped. And so, now it's a way to gain attention, clout, but ultimately it redirects any sort of nascent class consciousness rather, into a commodity, which, the left should know this. That's what capitalism does. But, the modern left is a joke. It doesn't really stand for anything. Let's see. Not salmon fish. Psychiatric alternative religion, MIC. PSYOP model of governance and devouring Mother Autistic culture. Not a sufficient economic hang-up against Tylenol as iron processing and liver. Not selection. Well, the resident schizoid will give it to you. That's pretty good. All right, everyone. This is Todd Lewis, Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.